Indeed. All right. Welcome, folks. Thank you for joining us for our honors colloquium here today for the fall 2023 semester. Very pleased to introduce Dr. Ross Alexander. He is our still new, right? President of A&M Texarkana, joined us towards the end of the summer. Prior to that, he was a provost at Northern Alabama University of Northern Alabama, and is a political scientist, having done his PhD at the University of Northern Illinois. Today he's going to be speaking to us on organizational and political leadership. So we should have some time for questions and such like at the end. But after that, I will turn it over to Dr. Alexander.
All right.
Thank you,
Greg. Appreciate it.
No worries, man.
Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm pleased that we're an intimate group. I might shift a little bit in my structure if that's okay. I've been fascinated with the study and the concept of leadership as long as I could remember. And I grew up in a politically active family, and I think that influenced my academic choices. And so I became a political scientist. My PhD is in political science, a political science professor for many, many years. And as a formal scholarly pursuit, I studied leadership and organizational behavior. And then as I got into administration, as a department chair and a dean and a provost and now as a president, I've only become more acutely interested in the concept and study of leadership and organizational behavior. And what I found is it's an ever-evolving concept, and it's an ever-evolving concern, right? Sometimes you fail, sometimes you succeed. You try to replicate the things that were successful, and you try to avoid the things that were unsuccessful, right? So it's a process of continuous improvement, and it's a process of discovery, and in many ways it can be humbling. And so if you study leadership, especially organizational leadership, and I have largely studied it from the public sector perspective, but public, private, and nonprofit sector leadership have a lot of intersectionality. About 75% the same. If you look at the curriculum of a Master's of Business Administration program, the curriculum of a Master of Public Administration program, they're going to look really, really similar, right? Leadership is leadership, right? And so I'm particularly fascinated by leadership in the postmodern era, right? By the postmodern era, I mean the last 20, 25, 30 years. Because organizations are much different than they were 30 years ago. And people in organizations have much different motivations than your parents or your grandparents did. Does that make sense? Right? And so I like to start this with the discussion of three complementary concepts. And that's management, leadership, and followership. For the first, 75 or 80 years of the study of organizational behavior, management is what was studied, right? Organizational management. It's only been the last 30 or 35 years that has evolved into the study of leadership. And so what's the difference between management and leadership? Go ahead.
Management is basically looking at everybody and telling them what their roles are. Then leadership is looking at the potential of people and rather guiding them to fulfill that potential of what they could be in order to advance their organizations.
It's a great answer. That's a great answer. Anyone else? The differences between management and leadership? In your own words, according to the literature, what have you? It's hard to beat that answer. But what she was getting at is management is very day-to-day detail oriented, right? It's the day-to-day oversight, paying attention to the details of an organization, of a team, of a group of people. What's kind of referred to as lower order skills, right? Leadership, on the other hand, as she stated, is about casting a vision, of getting people to coalesce around a vision, and leading them towards that larger organizational goal. And so you see management almost being negatively connoted, right? Of getting short shrift. I would argue that you can't be a good leader unless you're also a good manager. And you can't be a good manager unless you're also a good leader, right? I'm sure there's no one here at this organization, but you've probably all been around people who talk a good game and have no follow through, right? They would brand themselves a leader. They would come up with all these ideas and they wouldn't put in any work to get there, right? So that person might be exhibiting leadership skills, but they're not exhibiting management skills. And to be an effective organizational leader, you got to pay attention to detail. You got to lead from the front. You have to cast a vision. You have to motivate people to get there. So I would argue, you don't have to agree with me, that to be a good leader, you got to be a good manager. The third concept I want to discuss as a complementary term is something that's really only been addressed in the literature the last decade and a half. And that's a notion of followership. Followership. What do you think followership is?
Maybe the act of following.
Following direction, following instruction, right? Does a good leader also have to be a good follower? I think so, right? If you're a good leader, you empower people. If you're a good leader, you surround yourself with people smarter than you. If you're a good leader, you trust people to take action. You trust people to lead, right? So if you trust them to take action and trust people to lead in a certain situation, even though you have the title of leader, what do? You step back, right? And you follow. So this companion or complementary notion of followership, in my opinion, is just as vital as management in this overall context of leadership. Know when to lead, know when to manage, and know when to follow. Can anyone be a leader? Can anyone be a leader? Or is it something that can only be exhibited by a select few folks? I will have uncomfortable thoughts here. Someone whispered something.
I'll say yes.
I agree, right? Anybody else? Given a certain set of circumstances, anyone can exhibit the behavior to lead. It doesn't mean you got to make multi-million-dollar decisions. It doesn't mean that you got to lead hundreds of people. It doesn't mean that you have to be in a very public leadership position, but you can be a leader in your family, right? You can be a leader in your relationship. You can be a leader at even lower levels of the organization, okay? And that's also something kind of new in the literature of the postmodern organizational sector, is that this notion that anyone can be a leader. So, how are organizations different today than they have been in years past? And how does that thrust people into leadership positions earlier than they ever have? Okay, does that make sense? Right? Organizations that your parents and grandparents entered when they graduated from college, when they started their working lives, are much different than the organizations you're going to enter in the public, private, or nonprofit sector. First, organizations today are much flatter. By flatter, I mean they're not as routinized, they're not as hierarchical, right? They don't look like a pyramid. They look more like a square. And people, rather than being specialists, are generalists. Those who are successful in an organization 50, 75 years ago were specialists in very one little thing. I'm the best widget maker at the company, right? I'm the best policy analyst in Latin American politics in the CIA, right? Today, because organizations are flatter, you're going to be expected to be a generalist because there's fewer people in the organization, right? There's fewer people in the organization. So you're going to be entrusted and empowered to make leadership type decisions early in your career. Early in your career, much earlier than your parents or grandparents did. Second, one of the reasons that organizations are flatter is because of resource scarcity. Even in the corporate sector, the do more with less, but particularly in the governmental sector, post 9/11, with acute resource scarcity, again, you're going to be thrust into the mantle of leadership relatively early in your career, which can be very scary, but it's also quite an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for you to thrive and for you to succeed. And third, a hallmark of the modern organization is a high degree of turnover. A high degree of turnover. When your grandparents went into the working world after high school, probably, more often than not, they were going to work for the same company for 40 years, have a great pension, gold watch, go to Florida, right? That is not how organizations function any longer, okay? There is less organizational loyalty. There's a higher rate of employee turnover. There isn't the economic security. There isn't the level of benefits in the organizational sector that your grandparents enjoyed. And so what that engenders is a higher rate of turnover. So organizations are much more unpredictable. They're much more chaotic. They're much more volatile. Okay? All right. I know I'm not painting a very rosy picture here, but allow me to bring it around. But the organizations that you're going to enter into are much more difficult to work in, to manage in, and in which to lead than your parents or your grandparents. One hallmark of organizational leadership success is understanding motivation. What motivates employees? What motivates employees? And the biggest mistake that a leader can make, the biggest mistake that a manager can make, is assuming that what motivates you motivates her, and motivates her, and motivates him. Okay? What motivates you might not motivate people on your team, your colleagues, your superiors, your subordinates. You have to understand and respect that. Okay? Some people are motivated by financial incentives. Other people are motivated by non-monetary incentives, quality of work, flexible work arrangements, liberal dress codes, all the things that we've been discussing a lot here at A&M Texarkana. And that's a big change. That's a big change in the organizational setting over the last 20 or 30 years. But this notion of work-life balance, flexible and remote work, right, is much more part and parcel of organizational leadership today than it was in years past. Okay, where it was more of a transactional situation. I give you a salary, I give you good benefits, you have loyalty to the organization, more of a quid pro quo type of situation. All right. There are many ways to look at organizations or organizational theory. Traditionally, it was the systems theory of organization. Okay, there's a couple of historians of political science, and you know what I'm talking about, right? But the systems theory basically argues that bureaucracies, organizational structures are more enduring and more important than people in organizations. That's kind of how organizations function for 75 or 100 years. I don't subscribe to that belief. I subscribe to the human relations theory of leadership. Organizations are about people. And organizations are only as good as the people within them. Right? Happy people are more productive. Content people are easier to retain. And so you need to understand the motivations of folks for them to achieve maximum productivity. It's all right to treat people well and have them be productive. Those are not mutually exclusive goals. And we call that the human relations theory of leadership. Just quickly, because I know we don't have a whole lot of time, I kind of listed out several different types of leadership. The first few are what we call traditional types or theories of leadership, and the last few are more modern types of leadership. Transactional leadership is just what I had said. It's you pay me a salary, you give me benefits, and so I'm loyal to you and the organization. It's a quid pro quo transactional relationship. Bureaucratic leadership, again, evoking the system where organizational structures are more important than the people. Authoritarian or autocratic leadership, very command and control, very militaristic? Are there times where authoritarian or autocratic leadership is necessary?
Yes.
Yeah, like, you gotta storm the bunker. You're not gonna have a charrette and a discussion about it, right? You're gonna listen to your chain of command and hopefully y'all stay alive, right? And so there are times where authoritarian or autocratic leadership is perfectly appropriate. Delegative or democratic leadership, what we sometimes call laissez-faire leadership, more consensus-oriented, very decentralized in nature, right? Can sometimes become too decentralized. Charismatic leadership is a modern leadership type or theory that just assumes that people are motivated by a charismatic leader. They want to produce, they want to do well because they want to impress the leader. What's the problem with charismatic leadership? What if the charismatic leader leaves, right? And no one's ready to step up and assume that mantle of leadership. Servant leadership is this notion that the leader is there to serve those within the organization and put their needs and priorities first. And most scholars would say the idealized type of leadership is transformational leadership, right? That working with good folks by empowering folks in organizations, an effective leader is able to transform the organization. Leave it better than you found it, right? Leave it better than you found it. You transform the organization. Transformational leadership. These all make sense. And there are instances whereby each of these strategies is appropriate and can be utilized. So be thinking about what type of leadership you most often utilize and why, right? I'm a very practical person. I'm from the upper Midwest, a very practical region of the country. I would argue that all leadership is situational, right? All leadership is situation. It all depends on a particular set of circumstances, environmental factors, available resources, political priorities, political obstacles, realities, opportunities, and challenges. So the type of leadership that you employ relies upon the situation in which you find yourself. But I want you to have that in the back of your mind, this notion of situational leadership. Next, I'd like to go through some leadership axioms or principles or best practices or philosophy that I found helpful. It's impossible to get everyone in the organization completely aligned with your vision. And it's probably not healthy for everyone in the organization to be completely aligned with your vision. Dissent is healthy, right? Subversion is not healthy. Dissent is healthy, okay? So a leadership philosophy I have is resource the willing. For those people who are willing to evolve and change and adapt, you get them as many resources as possible. Convince the skeptical, which is going to be the majority of folks in any organization, right? Engage with them, prove it to them, and try to reduce their skepticism so they become in that group of willing, and ignore the curmudgeons, right? Ignore the curmudgeons. There's always going to be people in an organization that are against you just because they like being against you, right? And you have to understand that going into any situation. There's a just retired president of Carleton College in Minnesota, which is a very reputable, highly selective liberal arts school. And he just wrote a higher education book, the title of which is "Whatever It Is, I'm Against It." Right? And too often you'll see that. You'll see that, right? But you got to keep fighting. You got to keep fighting the good fight. Like I said earlier, confidently surround yourself with people smarter than you. It took me a while to gain the confidence to be able to do that. But once I started hiring people who were smarter than I, what do? They make you look good, right? Then you give them a bunch of resources. And then you say, hey, you know what? In 5 years, when I'm working for you, remember how nice I was, right? Okay? Confidently surround yourself with people smarter than you. That's not a failing of leadership, that's a hallmark of leadership. Next, diverse teams make better decisions. Diverse teams make better decisions. And I mean diversity broadly defined. Broad experiential diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, gender diversity, economic diversity, geographic diversity, right? The more perspective you have around the table, the better decisions and the better policy you are going to ultimately make. This next one I found to be 100% true. High performers will not tolerate low performers, and low performers begrudge high performers. Right? I found that to be 1,000,000% true. High performers will not tolerate low performers begrudge high performers. So do what you can do to get rid of low performers or bullies. Nothing kills a culture more quickly than empowering and allowing bullies. Right? You would think, especially at a university, that all these highly educated people, well-developed intellectual skills, not necessarily here, but in places I've worked, it's a 7th grade locker room, folks. Right? It is. It is. Right? Do what you can to limit the power and influence of bullies. Next, I handed out what I call the President's Cabinet Guiding Principles. My senior leadership team, I call the President's Cabinet. There's 5 folks and myself. This is Melody. Just raise your hand, Ms. Melody. Is one of them. She's my chief of staff. Okay. But I found it vitally important and successful to have rules of engagement, to have principles to which everyone adheres, to alleviate confusion, to make sure we're on the same page. And we routinely go over these principles and we review them. And we make sure that we are adhering to them. Once a year, I make everybody on my team sign it and date it. At least once a year. Okay? Then there's no doubt as to what the rules of engagement are for the senior leadership team. Okay? I'm not going to read these to you, but do any stand out to you? This is stuff I've developed from being a dean and a provost and now here. You pick up along the way.
I would say, unless I'm rhetorical.
No, go ahead.
I would say number 5, over communicate. That's something I know that certainly I've always thought, and I know a number of my colleagues has as well. I would always much rather know more about something rather than not know enough.
Especially in an academic environment.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And especially where possible, the communicating face to face. My former dean and I established what he called the Nikashian rule, that if we exchange more than 2 emails on something, we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, we're probably just going to get to a place where it's going to make it harder.
Right.
And he follows that now. So I not because I did anything well, but probably because I did something badly over email. And so he created a new law.
And we're a small enough place that we can do that. Right. Today, you and I both spoke at an event, but we were able to conduct a little business beforehand, and it saved us 3-4 emails. Sure. Right? Nobody wants to read a long email. Oh my God. Right? And nobody wants to read a dozen long emails. Your generation doesn't even send, you don't even know what an email is. Right? Not even a typewriter to you. Okay. Yeah, emails are the scourge of any organization. Plus, as a public employee, my emails can be subpoenaed.
Sure.
They can be subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. Right? You learn that the hard way. Okay. So never put anything in email that you wouldn't be comfortable having blasted on social media, or I'm going to make a very antiquated reference now, as a headline in a newspaper, right? Okay. But just be thinking about these. Just be thinking about these. And then ultimately, as you know, folks maybe don't do their best in adhering to these, I remind people, hey, you know, if you're gonna be communicating with your colleagues, subordinate, make sure you CC that person, right? Just so there's no surprises, right? Just so there's no surprises. All right, let's transition a little bit and talk about political leadership, which I can get real nerdy on, right? I taught political leadership as a course for the last 25 years. I would argue that all organizations are political, right? I subscribe to the following definition of politics. Who gets what, when, where, and how, right? Who gets what, when, where, and how. And by that definition, organizations are inherently political. Not necessarily capital P political, not necessarily administrative politics or elected politics or national politics or state or local politics, but political nonetheless, because there are scarce resources and some people get resources and some don't. Okay, so they are inherently political. They're inherently political. There is a fine line in political leadership for folks who are genuinely interested in serving the public, or what we call a public service motivation, versus folks who are self-interested, right? They're into electoral politics because of their self-interest. And you can take it a step further, and there are folks who are in the political sphere because they're megalomaniacs, right? They're narcissists. Okay. And too often you can see people move along that continuum pretty gosh darn quickly, right? Pretty gosh darn quickly. Okay. I had a very good colleague, and he had this axiom: never trust anyone who runs for an office higher than county commissioners. And you know what? I don't disagree with it, right? It's because if you're running for city council, if you're running for school board, if you're running for county commission, you're going to see your constituents at the grocery store, right, at the gas station, at the school board meeting, and you got to be literally accountable to your neighbors. You start getting up above that, and there's less direct accountability. I mean, this is just me talking as an individual now, but I can think of no worse job in the world than President of the United States. I mean, to willingly and actively sign up for that crucible of pressure, where even on your best day, half the people are against you, and on the worst day, 75% of the people are against you. I've been doing this for a long time, and I still can't understand the motivations of folks who seek that office. I'm glad there are people who do, but I think too often, because of the challenges, we keep recycling the same names, right? Okay, that's a little deflating. All right, now one of my favorite things for all the historians and political scientists in the room. One thing I like to do is occasionally go to rankings of presidents, and you can find these rankings all over the place. I like to use the C-SPAN ranking of U.S. presidents, and I use the 2021 C-SPAN ranking of U.S. presidents. It's kind of an aggregator. It's primarily historians who determine this. And I'm going to read out the top 12 and just let this list wash over you. Then I kind of want your opinion on it. All right. Number 1, Abraham Lincoln. 2, George Washington. 3, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 4, Teddy Roosevelt. 5, Dwight David Eisenhower. 6, Harry S. Truman. 7, Thomas Jefferson. 8, JFK. 9, Reagan. 10, Barack Obama. 11, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And 12, James Monroe. Reactions?
Truman and Eisenhower.
Well, no, okay, now let's not. Truman, okay, but I digress. Just give me the hook whenever you need to give me it. Truman, right? If you know the circumstances by which he became president, FDR had a lot of vice presidents, right? And Truman was a first-time vice president. FDR dies a couple of months into his 4th term. Truman had met with him more than a couple of times. What's concluding at this time in 1945? The Second World War. What big decision needs to be made at the conclusion of the Second World War?
The demilitarization of Germany at the Potsdam Conference.
But even before that, or during that time, how did the war end?
Which one? The one
I think
against Germany or the one against Japan?
We dropped a couple of big bombs, right? Okay, all right. So who had no advance notice, had not been involved in these discussions. Hey, we got this really big bomb. Well, how big? Really big, right? And that's really your first leadership decision. That's going to change the course of world history forever, right? That's a tough decision. That's a tough decision. You can draw the conclusion you want, whether that was the right or the wrong thing. When Truman left office, he had a 22% approval rating. History's been kind to Truman. He is one of the highest rated presidents, as you can see, as we've seen kind of his policies and his decisions be successful.
Yeah, I was gonna say, the thing that struck me about that list is that it definitely privileges leaders who were seen as decisive. Notably, there's no one on that list from Reconstruction up until, you get to Teddy Roosevelt. It's about a 40-year period of weak presidents, right?
Yeah.
Presidents who are kind of taking a back
Right,
seat
right,
to
right.
Congress. Yeah, no one's up there saying, hey, Ben Harrison. That's
Right,
who we
right.
No, so there is a privileging of strong executive leadership on that list, which I thought was interesting.
Without a doubt, Grant's been getting a lot of runs here in the last 10 or 15 years, and he's kind of moving up the rankings. But from like the 1840s till 1860, it's all these folks you never heard of. And then like after 1870, it's a bunch of folks, right? Like to your point. And they're very deferential to Congress. All right, if I'm going to quibble on one, it's going to be JFK.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and again, just speaking as an individual here, I would argue that JFK is not only the most overrated president in our history, he might be the most overrated person in history, right? And do a deep dive. And again, just speaking as an individual, right?
But if we were gonna use your types of leadership, I would take him as a charismatic leader.
Sure.
Maybe that's why he ranks so high, because he inspires so many people.
Inspired many, right? Was president for a very short period of time. How did he do on civil rights?
He had a really open mind.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
open mind, not much happening.
I love studying the juxtaposition between Kennedy and Johnson,
Yeah.
because it's Johnson who early in his career is kind of reprehensible, right? Who's actually, but he knows Congress, and he's able to get major systemic civil rights legislation passed because of his influence and his experience in Congress, right? He saw which way the wind was blowing. Anybody that you were kind of not expecting to see on that list? Ronald Reagan, right? Kind of a recency. Right? There were some relatively recent presidents on here that I was surprised were included as well. Anybody else? Anybody else you wish you would have seen on there? Anybody a big James K. Polk fan or something like that? Right?
It was the 13.
That's a good question. Polk was right up there, right?
Andrew Jackson, not Andrew Jackson. I thought I looked at 13.
No,
It was 13.
Yeah, Woodrow Wilson, which makes sense, right? Yeah. During the time, and one thing that you really have to, and Craig can teach this better than I. You really have to be careful not to be present-minded, right? You gotta be past-minded. You gotta put yourself in the time in which these folks were making decisions, okay? Because if you look through a modern lens, it kind of clouds. The probably have a minute or so. All right. So wrapping up, I'm gonna read you some of my favorite leadership quotes, if that's okay, just a couple of them. Sure. And I'll start with Harry Truman. Okay, Harry Truman, the Midwestern philosopher. Never kick a fresh turd on a hot day. That is one of my favorite, right? Don't take a bad situation and make it worse. Just leave it alone. Winston Churchill, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they tried everything else. Third, Winston Churchill again. The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Right? Ralph Waldo Emerson, nothing astonishes men so much as common sense and plain dealing. Dwight David Eisenhower, never underestimate the power of stupid people in large groups. And then I'll give you 2 from my parents. First, my mom, worry in order, right? And that's something I've always, worry in order, okay? Do what immediately needs to be addressed first and then after that. And then one from my dad who grew up on a dairy farm in northern Wisconsin. The cows aren't going to milk themselves, right? Which is just basically get to work. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Any questions you have?
We'll say thank you first.
Thank you.
We are up against a 1 o'clock class, I must confess, but if you have any very, very quick questions, feel free to ask, or you can capture them before you leave. If you haven't signed in, I think most everyone here has, but if you haven't signed in yet, we do have our sheet. I did get our Zoom friends on there already, so thank you, folks. And we will be in touch on our next event. Is actually going to be November 2nd for Hispanic Heritage Month. It's going to be co-done with Dr. Rincon, and then we have another colloquium the following week. So I'll send all that out as we get closer. But thank you very much, folks. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it. So thanks for that. Yeah, that was good.